Hello, Silas here. In this video, this presentation, it's going to be an expansion on certain arguments that I get against the non-aggression principle. Now, the non-aggression principle is a deontological ethical system that I use as a foundation to navigate my reality tunnel. It proposes that we should not initiate the use of force against others, and unlike pacifism, it does not preclude things like self-defense. The previous definition video is about 10 minutes long, and I'll encourage you to check that out if you've never heard of the non-aggression principle before. But in this video, I'll be expanding on it and making the case that we are moving towards a more non-aggression principle compliant society. And since most of our interactions are already non-aggression principle compliant, it's just about getting over that last small bit. The format for this is going to be about a 3-minute intro, then different sections, and then a conclusion at the end. You can jump around. There's going to be an illustration, a speed drawing going on the screen as it goes on that's related to this, but enjoy. So here we are into this part of the video where I said I'm going to be discussing certain arguments against the non-aggression principle, or the general themes of it. And I'm currently working my way through this book called Something Deeply Hidden, Quantum Worlds and the Emergence of Spacetime by Sean Carroll. And with quantum physics, it's something I found out about over a decade ago, and it's been very confusing to me. It started with, I'm pretty sure this is when it started, my interest with quantum physics and quantum mechanics, which is the field that has come from quantum physics. I was back in college taking a ceramics course. My professor had mentioned something about the process, about how light is created when you heat up the things, and then he got into how there are certain elements at the smallest measurement that we can get to that are thought to be waves, but when you actually observe them, they turn into particles. I was already very interested in ceramics, just the process of getting mud and making something. I can understand why so many religions use it as the creation myth, because it's just an amazing process to do. And then getting more into quantum physics, starting to pick up some books, starting to try and understand those things. And the years between then and now, from this just random conversation about quantum physics, to me going to getting books, to me actually picking up this book right now by Dr. Carroll and trying to understand what's going on here. And he's actually pointing out that there actually is something that changes things once you actually observe it. So the reason I brought this up is I think the non-aggression principle might be to social interactions what quantum mechanics is to the physics world. In the sense that with quantum physics, Dr. Carroll was talking about how it's not necessarily completely understood even by people that use it, but all over the world we use it. The computers that we're using, the technology I'm using to record this and make this video, make this presentation and send it out to you guys and for you guys to use it involves quantum physics. So the physicists, the engineers, and the mechanics, the people who actually put these things together, maintain these systems that we use, they use quantum mechanics to make certain predictions and calculations based on the rules in quantum physics, but they can't necessarily explain every single part of why those things work. But they do work. So I am still in the introductory parts of the book. I'm going back and forth trying to get the basic material stuck in my head before I actually go into the main body of the book. But I think the non-aggression principle has some basic aspects that are rather simple, that are rather easy to understand. And I haven't found any cogent arguments against those points. And I think we all use the non-aggression principle in majority of our life. We're not just going around punching people willy-nilly. Most of our lives are non-aggression principle compliant. So now let me get into it. Thanks for listening. This stuff is very important to me. If you've heard about it before and it's also important to you and that's why you clicked here to listen to this, welcome and thanks for listening as well. And thank you for talking about it. Hopefully you can share this with other people. If you've never heard of this or if you have arguments against it, hopefully something in this presentation can make you more convinced of how important this actually is. And again, you can share it with other people. So I'm going to be discussing general themes that are brought up against the non-aggression principle. And we're going to start with people who say that it's impractical. And yeah, you might say that, but that's a very subjective term. For example, somebody's diet. I have had issues with my weight, body composition. I've always been rather heavy for my age. I think when I was in 8th grade, which is about, no, even earlier than 8th grade. Yeah, 8th grade, I think I got to 200 pounds, which is over 45 kilograms, I think. It's like 2.2 pounds per kilogram, something like that. So, no, that's 90. Sorry, math is garbage. Don't listen to me about math, which I just opened with quantum physics, which I'm like, why is this guy talking about? Anyway, so back into this. I've had issues with my body weight, at least my body composition, since I was younger. I have the ability to gain weight, but that can be weight in muscle in a healthy way, or it could be fat and more unhealthy. So, there is a target diet that everyone can follow. For some people, eating a peanut means they're going to gain more muscle from the nutrition in it. Some people will eat that same peanut and die because they're allergic to it. So there's certain diets, there's certain targets where you can say this is a guide. If you're trying to get to X, you can do it in these kind of ways. So the actual principle itself of being a healthy person is a principle whether or not you're able to get there in what you consider a simple way. Now, speaking about whey, there's things like whey protein and all these other things that are in the market today to get people who want to be stronger and more beefy. I grew up when I was still reading comic books when they still had those adverts for the strength thing. It was towards the tail end of that. But you look at the strongman from back in the 80s and the 70s, and you just look at your average fit person in the United States of America who goes to the gym on a regular, and the person today, their nutrition is a lot more on point than it is back then. By using supplements, by having better ideas of what workouts to use, how to target different body parts. You look at the top bodybuilders or Olympia people, now they're taking anabolics and things like that. And those people look straight comic book. They look cartoonish compared to the people in the past. Now you can also go with the whole like physique thing. You can look at the people like Arnold, but that was I think the golden age. But we're just talking about a really strong, beefy man 30 years ago versus a really strong, beefy man today. It's an entirely different thing because of the access to information, resources, workouts, nutrition that we have today. So something that might have been impractical back then, looking like Superman, you have people who don't even qualify for Olympia who look a lot stronger than the original Superman did. I opened up with setting up impractical and setting up that subjectivity of the situation, since most of the pushback I get to this comes with the whole it's unimaginable. And I think when most people say unimaginable, what they're really thinking about is impractical. So I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation expanding on this point, going over certain things that a few generations ago, or a few years ago, or just historically might have been unimaginable due to the realities that people's reality tunnels were going through during that time, that now we take for granted. It's even hard for us to imagine a time when these things didn't exist. And I think that same thing is occurring when it's hard for us to imagine a future when the non-aggression principle can be something we all live by. So as I go through these, there's certain things that have started and there's certain things that ended. Think about how you'd explain the ends or the lack of these things existing or the starts of these things existing to a human who was living 50 years before that start or end occurred. So I'm going to start off with an easy one. Slavery. This is something that I think all of you listen to this, or most of you, 99.999%, don't want to say never here. There might be somebody here who still thinks slavery is a good thing. But for most of you, you would agree that slavery is something that has ended. It's going to be hard for most of you to think of a time when we're going to regress back to when we're owning other people. And if you can otherize other human beings to the point where you can own them as objects, then the non-aggression principle cannot be applicable in that relationship, in that interaction. But now we have a general knowledge of humans as a human species, of having agency, of not being able to be owned. So there's still definitely holdouts in this kind of situation where that happens. There's arguments about the state being actually some form of slavery that I don't necessarily completely agree with. At least it's not chattel slavery in that sense. So going back to that point, I don't really see a time where we can go back to that. How would you take away the knowledge and awareness that we have to go back to that point when slavery is okay? I think we have disabused ourselves of the notion or the basic notions, the basic foundations that you can actually have a society that includes slavery in it. And I think we're heading further and further away from that. And that is also a future that I see that is more welcoming of the non-aggression principle. Next, I'll move on to peaceful parenting. So hitting children and using other forms of aggression in parenting has been a common thing for most of known history. This concept of peaceful parenting is rather recent. It was actually well advised. It was so common in society that even popular contemporary religions, such as Christianity, the followers of this would twist the actual Bible, the actual words, the dogma, and say things like, spare the rod, spoil the child, into a defense for child abuse. And when we're actually on this topic, I want to do a little aside here. That actual line or verse that people use is actually more about guidance. The rod itself, a literal rod, was used to measure something or to aim or to point at something. So it's more like use guidance. If you spare guidance, if you spare direction, if you don't actually use something to make sure the child is going in the right path, then you will spoil the child. But the fact that it took this long for people to get to the point where they're reading it that way, and they were so accepting of it being a rod that you actually hit the child with, shows how common and accepted hitting children was. So these concepts are very connected. I think part of the pushback to the non aggression principle is how few people have actually been peacefully parented. I think these will grow together. They're very connected. So, how many people today do you think were never subjected to aggression from those stronger than them as a child, during their childhood? How many people in positions of power did not experience the very distinct might makes right situations in their formative years? You add non physical forms of abuse and mistreatment such as neglect, fraud, denigration, overmedication, indoctrination, and so on. And then I ask you, imagine the changes in the world when you can confidently say that 10% of the population, even just 10% of the population, have not experienced any form of abuse as children. So these things do start early. They start in our childhood. We start learning these patterns. We start having these pushback to it. It starts in our family, our relations, our early experiences. I'm going to keep it in the family here, and I'm going to move on to spousal abuse. This is another thing where there's apologetics for it. The whole rule of thumb. Oh, it's okay to beat your wife and kids as long as you don't beat them with a stick or a rod thicker than your thumb. That's something that has been in common parlance for a long time in recent history. In some places, it's still there. The actual numbers between domestic violence are still horrifically high. People accept this as part of how they live because they grew up in environments like that. But for many of you listening to this, you would not necessarily think, I'm going to hit my kids. I'm going to hit my wife. Even if you grew up in an environment where you were hit, you normally hit your kids less. Even if you grew up in an environment where your parents were hitting each other, you normally hit your spouse less. Now, if this change can occur in people who haven't been exposed to or consciously aware of something like the non aggression principle, this is what's been happening anyway as we go on. That gives me optimism that we are moving towards a more non aggression principle compliant environment. So we're going to keep on this learning thing and branch out a bit to schooling, the school system. So think of the school system where you live. For many of you, you can't imagine a society without that system. Or can you? Can you think of other ways? I know some people are going to be more into homeschooling and different kind of things. There's been other competitive ways to actually get to learning, and that's improving day by day to my great pleasure. So for many of you, it's you'll have a mandatory or a centralized kind of system. It could be mandatory. I just saw this news story where I think somewhere in the UK it was proposed that the Labour Party or something, the people who supported the Labour Party voted on the actual policies, and they were actually proposing on banning private schools. So that whole school system is so good that they have to ban any competition that's in there. So anyway, if you have that situation where there's a mandatory system, can you imagine that society without the school system that you grew up in? Or is it a generational thing? How long has this system been actually going on? Can you imagine your grandkids, your great grandkids? Will they be going through the same school system that you have today? Chances are they're not going to. But for you, this may be unimaginable to think of a different way to actually go through that, even though some of you may have parents who learned things in ways that are completely separate from that school system that you consider to be unimaginable. Now, that school system that you have, is it common for teachers to actually use corporal punishment in your school systems? Because here in Kenya, there's still some where that's a common thing. Parents are actually giving permission to the teachers to beat their kids. This happened in one conversation I had with a parent. I was like, oh, that's horrible. I mean, you're like, oh, you need to hit my kid, otherwise my kid's not going to actually learn well. That's a crazy thing for many of you in the West to actually hear and believe, yet it's commonplace in other places in the world. So even though I'm not supportive of current Western systems that claim a bad grade is abuse, I am glad that we're not in a situation where abuse itself, physical abuse itself, is not considered not abuse. So that's one thing that I think would be unimaginable for most of you, to imagine a school system where corporal punishment was brought back as a regular common teaching tool. And now think, if you are a teacher in the Western system where you're not hitting kids or you've taught in other ways, how would you teach the teachers or people teaching in systems that use corporal punishment how to teach children? What would you tell them to explain that, hey, there's actually other, more peaceful ways to do this that are actually effective? So I'm going to transition off to more general society now. This is an adult content video. Maybe I'll make some children's version of this, but I think for now, let's keep it to adults, and we're going to go into sexuality. There's going to be different parts in this, and we're going to keep it with the topic of kids. This might be testy for some people, but I think it's important to go over this material, this challenging material, and have actual points and to hammer this down to you. But think about something like pedophilia. So, for most of you listening to this, you'll agree that adults should not have sexual relations with children. Now, the definition of what a child is may change for some of you, and it's different in different countries and areas. But I think in general, we can say it's prepubescent humans should not be violated by post-pubescent humans. That's just the general thing I'm thinking about here. But you still have many places in the world where child brides are a common thing. How would you go and tell these people, hey, maybe you shouldn't marry that girl, she's kind of too young? Now, you still have major religions where teen virgins can be immaculately impregnated by gods, and perfect humans are shown to have perfect behavior to take on single-digit aged brides. Now, these proposed concepts in these mythologies are things that even the most ardent believers in these things will try to avoid discussing. And when they actually come up, there's many apologetics to actually deal with it. Say it was about the time, it's about the situation, but even that alone is the point. There was a time and a situation where that was actually an okay thing to do, but due to the time and situation we live in now, it is unimaginable to most of you. So how would you go back and explain to those people that, hey, if your world is XYZ like it is today, this situation that you might be doing right now that you consider as moral would be unimaginable. Now, two more subtopics on this topic of sexuality, so bear with me here. And we're going to move on to another one that is testy for people, and that is incest. So again, this is not something that most of you would consider doing. Even recently, there's been an uptick between certain groups of bringing in back the tribe knowledge, or we need to keep our women should stay with us. But with these cultures that I'm seeing this uptick in this, they're not going to the point of full keep our women ours and saying that I need to keep my sister mine, I need to keep my brother mine. They're still getting to situations where they understand there needs to be some separation. We might think of a larger tribe, a larger race, a larger in-group to choose from. But going back to incest is so taboo that it's unimaginable for so many people. It's one of those things when your culture, your society gets over it, it doesn't go back to it. And the whole go back to it thing, or getting over it thing, it wasn't too long ago that people were actually using it in a very common thing. And even in the West, in the first world, it is still fetishized in some places. Very recently, some of the very same people that many of us look up to, the elites and people like that, were deeply involved in incest. So it's in there in most contemporary dogma as well. It's just a common thing in there. It's there with the royals of essentially any country that has a proud history of that country saying, we need to keep our proud history. We're proud Xers, citizens of X. This is part of our culture. These are our rulers. And they look back and most of those people were incestuous. Many of us can look back a generation or two ago and find incest in our families. Now, the definition of who is related, as I said, is going to change. But social circumstances have rendered incest to be essentially unimaginable for many of us, and I think that's a positive thing. Like the term of consanguinity, there's certain things that before it was considered something that we shouldn't do, there wasn't even terms for this, there weren't even words for this, they weren't even used. Now we have laws and rules and regulations that prohibit this behavior, or at least tell people not to do it. People who actually would consider doing it, that we consider those who would do it, kind of shunned by society. And I think most of you listen to this, would be okay with that, even if we didn't have this compulsory state system. If you could choose to live in a community that was okay with it, you would probably choose the one that doesn't have it if all other things were comparatively the same. Now, there's going to be some challenges to this. It's another aside here that I'm thinking may come through the same kind of technology, the genetics that find out that, hey, these people having these, I think there's something like the Habsburg jaw, that if you look that up online, find images of it, and you can see these features. But with things like genetic editing, there's probably going to be an ability for you to take out these negative results that could occur from having consanguineous relations. So when this happens, there may be less social stigma going into it. People might be like, oh, these people choose to do it, so it's different, and the actual negative genetic results from it are not there. So I don't know. So it might be like this common religious trope that is currently most famous by this certain Bronze Age religion's account of how a triune deity conceived ghost-aided conception of its mortal self with a human being. And this may be a more common and considered immaculate, even this process, to even have a child from two sex cells from your own body that gestate in a separate human or an artificial womb. Like this is going into the technology of finding a stem cell from somebody and then turning that stem cell into a sperm cell and an egg cell. Even if that person is male or female, you can technically do this. So this technology is coming, so things are going to come up. Now, talking with technology and changing what happens with sexuality and that little innuendo of coming, there is also porn. Now, just the general access to pornography that people have has changed, I think, the way social dynamics occur. Certain expectations, certain behaviors, certain ways of looking at things are entirely different. There was that whole thing where the oldest profession is prostitution, and I don't necessarily think that is quite accurate. I think it was some kind of merchant is actually the oldest profession, or a hunter, or a god gatherer, something like that, a farmer. It wasn't prostitution. So wherever you stand on the topic, whether it's moral or immoral or not, that's not the point I'm trying to make here. I'm just trying to say, think of the access to pornography that you have today. Masturbation in my lifetime was considered very taboo, still is considered very taboo by certain groups and things like that. We still had the whole situation of, oh, you're going to go blind, you're going to get hairy palms if you do it. That doesn't necessarily happen. I mean, I don't really hear people touting this. Of course, there's going to be people still talking about it. And there's actually positives and negatives about this. Like I said, that's not the main topic here. But how would you explain the current access to pornography, the current billion-dollar industry on sex toys that mainly focuses on women, the sexual liberation kind of environment and things like that? How would you explain that to some people 200 years ago? Now, you could say that you go back to maybe the Greeks and the Roman times and these classic books and things like that, and you can say they were maybe as openly into sexuality as we are today in Western society, in first world countries. But then someone might also say that's because that was at the end of their civilization, and this civilization is also going to end, and we're going to go to a cyclical place where sexuality is more sacrosanct and more cherished and not as cheap as some people may consider it today. Next, I think this might be part of the sexuality thing, or just talking about the pornography and the sexuality and things like that, keeping it more sacrosanct. I think that would be the whole marriage situation. The whole situation of you have to marry a virgin, keeping your virginity until marriage is still very valuable for many people. But when you look at the West, if you don't marry before your teens, in many cases, the person you marry is not going to be the first person you have sexual relations with. The whole idea of monogamy is something that is rather recent in cultures, in societies. Is it necessarily the best system? I don't know. I think it's positive. I think it's something I would be glad to experience. I didn't necessarily have this mentality my whole life, but I've looked at the options out there. But it is a rather recent thing. They may have been coupling before where people would stay together, but biologically and evo-psychologically, would that be evolutionarily psychologically, or would it just be evolutional psychologically? Anyway, so evocycling, we are a tournament species. I think that's how we were. And that maps on to being sexually dimorphic, where the males and females are of different sizes. So we look at other apes and things like that, and they don't necessarily have monogamous pair bonding. They might have serial monogamy where they partner with somebody, have children, get through the point where the children can kind of be adults or self-sufficient, and then they move on to other partners and things like that, where you have very few people actually reproducing, very few males in general reproducing, when situations where I think when hunter-gatherers started coming, you had a situation where certain males were getting so many resources that it was something like 30% of the males were reproducing and 70% of the females, and the other people just didn't get to reproduce, so mostly males. So anyway, you have that kind of situation where with monogamy coming in, that came in for different reasons and resulted in more people passing on their genes, more males having access to passing on their genes, and also resulted in more stable societies. So many societies consider monogamy to be a bedrock of their culture or their civilization, where to bring back polygamy or the current popularizing of polyamory and other arrangements is something unimaginable to many people. So now, how would you, as somebody who thinks monogamy is the way society should exist, how would you go to somebody that has been living in a culture that has been polygamous for their known history, a culture that may have a faith system that actually has polygamy as part of it, as a key part of it? How do you tell that person to let go of that polygamy and move on to monogamy? Now, this is one of the challenges. The belief system, the faith people have in certain things, in certain ways that things are supposed to be, versus the evidence. What sort of evidence do you provide to challenge somebody's ideas about the way things can work when those ideas are based on faith? So this comes to the whole worship of the gods things. There was a time when worshiping, being somebody of the faith, included knowing where your typical altars were. You had to go there, you committed animal and human sacrifices. So it was a commonplace thing. But now, for most of you listening to this, even if you are considering yourself very faithful, you don't do that. Even if some of you in your dogmatic books have instructions of how to commit these sacrifices, these offerings to your gods. It's a common thing that in many of these holy books that claim to have eternal truths, it includes sacrificing your own children to these gods. And that's considered a good, positive thing. And I think most of you listening to this would say no. And if you saw anyone actually do this, you would consider them insane. But then there are those people out there who, unfortunately, unless it's to the god of statism, the Zer Zit, the good of the greater. So for some people who have that god in mind, they're still unfortunately willing to figuratively sacrifice the mental comfort or the mental stability of their children's mind. And the current year situation right now when I'm recording this, you might be listening to this later, but for some of you who, if you're not listening to this in less than 10 years, according to some of these people's claims, there may be no world left for you to actually still listen to this video unless we do something right now. Unless we give the sacrifices out there as a community, as a world community, to the gods of climate catastrophe or crisis or change or whatever it is being called now, we won't be here anymore. So that whole sacrifice thing is still going on. But how would you explain to people 2,000 years ago that, hey, maybe that God doesn't necessarily need you to sacrifice that goat on this altar in order for the weather to change? That maybe it's a complex system that we are just a minute part of on this globe that we live in, involving solar flares and the oceans holding water that runs on cycles of centuries and things we don't know. How would you explain that to somebody who would consider that unimaginable to not have to give sacrifices to their gods? So now moving on, we're going to go on to words. Words used to actually mean what words meant. Now that seems to be more flowing. They seem to move and it's more what you want them to mean and what you think they should mean. Like I was talking about these believers before. You could say certain words that were considered blasphemous and you could be killed for it. You used to actually put your life on the line based on the words that you chose to say. Now you can lie willy-nilly and get away with it for little to no issue. You can scream the sky is falling as much as you want, and it seems like people don't really listen to the whole Chicken Little thing anymore, where people still believe people who constantly say the sky is falling, the sky is falling, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Then when the sky is actually falling, nobody listens to you, and then you get hurt or other people get hurt. So there are different versions of this story, but the general theme is the whole warning people, the hysteria, and this is a common thing that we do just going into hysterics over things that are not really there. So you can go back to the whole seriousness. I think it was a Dave Chappelle sketch where he's like, oh, if somebody used to say something, somebody had to go. It's like back in the day, you could just say something, somebody had to die after you said certain things. Even in my day, when I was in school, the whole your mama thing would be a reason to actually fight. I think that has lessened. I could be wrong. I've been out of school for a while, not hanging out with kids anymore. People who have kids, is that still a thing? If you're a kid listening to this, first of all, this was an adults only video. Why are you listening to this? But welcome anyway. But now that I think about this, maybe it's lessened because it's patriarchy. Maybe we're not actually getting into a more non aggression principle compatible mentality, but it's just patriarchy, which has increased and no longer makes people want to beat others up for talking ill about the females in their lives. What do you think? How many of you actually think if somebody just says something about my mom, I am going to kill this person? The term motherfucker used to be something worth killing people over. Now kids say this. It's just a passing thing. Words have changed. There's certain words that we use commonly that were used in the past that would be life or death issues. So how would you bring somebody from that past to the present today and have him hear some word and have him try to beat up or kill this person? How do you explain to that person that, oh no, that's just a passing greeting. That's just something friends do to each other anymore. It's not worth actually killing someone over. How would you explain that to somebody who considered uttering that word to be unimaginable? So continuing on this whole situation of words, I don't necessarily think being a man of your word was a bad thing. As you can see, I am a man of several words, and most people would think at this point, hey, maybe this would be the good point to actually break this video up into two videos, and it's two presentations. Well, you don't have to listen to the entire thing at one go. You can listen to it in different sections, and I'll try to give little notes or different kind of chapters or points that you can kind of jump to and share with people. But you could also listen to 2 times speed. You could listen to this over some time. There's no one forcing you to do this. There's no enforcement agency. I'm not a law and order enforcement agency to force you to listen to this in a certain way, even though I think this is important in how we can have a more positive and capable system of law and order in the future. Because as I've said before, the non-aggression principle does not mean no laws, no order, and that's the next topic, law and order. So not too long ago, open executions were thought to be needed to keep order. In some places, this is still thought to be true, and in the places where it's not thought to be true anymore, they seemingly have forgotten the past when it was true in their cultures, because some people are going back to those histories, yet not calling for that, because they look at the cultures where they still do these open executions and consider that barbaric. So, there's something to be said about that, and I think that's a positive thing. So those certain places that still have these open executions also have more physical forms of retribution and punishment for crimes being violated. In the places where open executions are things in a forgotten history, a forgotten memory of theirs, you have situations where the quality of life for your average prisoner, and this isn't hyperbole, can actually be higher than that of homeless people in those very same societies. It could be a situation where that homeless person will commit a crime so they can actually get imprisoned, and then in prison they have a higher standard of life. Now, don't quote me on that. I think it's pretty sure, but I think in those countries they're also going to have different systems to deal with the homeless people, or the unhoused, which is a new term that I've actually learned that is being used in the United States of America about the unhoused epidemic. Well, anyway, one thing I am pretty sure of is the cultures that have abolished public executions and the cultures that have them, some of them, I think the life in prison in those cultures without the public executions can be better than the average life of a middle class person in the societies that actually have public executions. Okay, I'm not quite sure for that, but I think you look at the people who are at the poverty level doing the menial labor jobs, then most of the people in prison in those countries would look at those other countries that have more physically violent, corporal punishment involved law and order systems. And they would look at those quality of lives and say, no, I don't want to live in that slum. I don't want to live like the people who are in the poverty equivalent of that place.
One more thing about the standard of life thing in prison, there is the whole restriction of one's movement, which people don't like in general. And even if it improves one's quality of life in amenities, in many cases, the people feel like they have a responsibility to not do this, to not leech off of society.
Now, I'm going to take this beyond the whole social aspect of it or the whole governmental law and order enforcement system there, but even on the personal level. I'm going to touch back on the man of your word situation. Think about the Japanese culture. This might just be historical, but some of you may have seen this, some of you may have not. But there's this whole thing that's in there with the whole chopping off the finger thing and like the Yakuza, which is the gang there. And then even you just have gangs in general in the Western environments who have this more, oh, to get into the gang, you have to get beaten, there's hazing and things like this that are involved in certain fraternities, certain sports teams, certain organizations, where violence is used as a more common thing.
There were rites of passage. It used to be common to use violence. Here in Kenya, you still see people in their early teens, boys in their early teens, going through processions in city roads, heading to a location where they're going to get circumcised.
But we've gotten to a society where that is reduced, where we still have these organizations, we still have these groups, but the violence isn't as common. I think historically, this is something that's actually there in the history books. In Japan, they had the whole seppuku practice. And that was the disembowelment following certain failure. You've lost face, and then now you have to kill yourself, go past the whole cutting off the finger. This was considered to be a welcome position to stand in for somebody that was committing seppuku to chop their head off. Like after they used, I think, the kodashi or the smaller sword to cut open their gut, they had a special sword, I think, a shorter sword to cut open their midsection, have their intestines fall off, then you stand above them and then you chop the head off. This was just a common practice thing. This mentality, this behavior, this cultural belief system might have carried on to things like the kamikaze pilots. And it also may be a specifically male thing to lose face and have to put your body on the line in that kind of situation. And that could be part of why there's a much higher suicide rate among males, even though this might be successful suicides versus suicide attempts, because women might do it as much but not be as effective in actually ending up to kill themselves.
And this is a case where it's okay to have lower achievement standards than men. And it could also be with society. Maybe we need to pay more attention to what men are going through, whereas we pay attention to the women due to their higher intrinsic biological value, and we can pick up on the signs that are heading towards suicide, whereas with the men, we don't even notice them. You know, with the whole man up thing with no equivalent of woman up.
One more thing here. So there was a time transitioning from when people glorified the murder of people for committing crimes, the punishment in that situation, where they considered it more of a necessary part of society. But these executioners, even though there was court executioners, towns and things like this, I've read this manga called Innocent that goes over the Sanson family in France, and it's has some historical accuracy. It's historical fiction and things like that. Excellent art. But it was talking about how the executioner family was passed on. It was a job that was passed on, the House of Sanson. But they weren't considered polite part of company. They were considered to be necessarily evil. And I think we're in a part like that where for a lot of us, it's not necessarily non-aggression principle is unimaginable, is that there's certain structures in society that are there that we all kind of consider to be necessary evils because we haven't necessarily thought of a way to do it without so much aggression, without so much violation of the non-aggression principle. And going back to that manga about the Sanson family, one thing I really appreciated in it was they were showing that the Sansons understood it was their responsibility. They understood they had to do this. But at the same point, they were also trying to find cleaner ways to do this, like when they developed the guillotine. Guillotine? Guillotine. Anyway, you know what I mean. The whole machine where you put the blade up and you drop the blade and you put the person's head through the hole and things like that, and the head falls into the basket. Yeah, that thing. And even at that point, they were kind of against doing the whole drawing and quartering thing, where that was just, no, that was not to be done unless it was a very specific situation and they understood it would enrage the crowd for this to happen. So that's kind of how I look at a lot of people who are currently the major violators of the non-aggression principle by running state systems, is I have enough optimism to think that most of the people are well-meaning and trying to find better ways to do certain things. So it's up to people who are aware of the non-aggression principle to think of solutions and think of ways and at least talk about this more, spread this message around, and we can come together and possibly find better ways of doing things. So while we're on the topic of doing things in better ways, or things that seemingly have to be done and finding better ways to do them, we need to talk about full spectrum war here. For some people, the idea of war is inevitable. They still talk about it, that it's something that's coming. We need to change XYZ, or a war is coming. We're going to get into this situation where there's a war on this, there's a war on that. We need to start a war on this. We need to tackle this with a war, and war here, war there. And I'm like, what are you guys talking about? It's normally a figurative situation. They're not literally talking war in the sense that the word means for some of us. Now, I'm recording this in 2020. You go back 100 years ago, and this was shortly after the end of the First World War. Now, there had been wars before. Europe had been through 100-year wars, 7-year wars, this different kind of wars, Napoleonic wars. Other places had their wars. You go to China, and other places, and they had their regional wars and things like that. In Africa, they still weren't as big in nations, but there were still situations where, like South Africa, which currently has the Zulus when the Europeans got there, but they had been different wars of large tribes moving around to different areas in Africa. So that's been happening. But that whole idea of a world war was very new. Because remember, there was a time when people didn't even have the concept of a world. They didn't have the concept of being able to actually get to certain places to even care about what was happening in that place. But the First World War was like, wow, this was the World War. And it was mostly involved in Europe. But during that time, let's say you went back 150 years ago, could you explain to the kings and queens of that time that something like the First World War was about to occur unless they changed things? Then after the First World War, could you go to France and talk to the forces there, the countries there, and say, that Treaty of Versailles, maybe you shouldn't offer that. Maybe that's going to lead to complications. Could you go back and maybe take a book like The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and you see what Hitler went through in that time, how it led to all this, and tell them, maybe this Hitler guy, you should kind of watch it. Maybe something should be changed in this point and that point, and you're actually going to lead to a full spectrum war where entire nations are kind of tied together in this global war kind of situation with all these people dying. Could you truly explain that to people and get them to stop? How would you do that? That was unimaginable type of things to occur. Yet, some of the developments that occurred in that, the technology, the advancements, the mentalities, I think those things have led to situations where those same things are unlikely to happen. When we talk about wars right now, war on poverty, war on women, war on education, climate change war, war this, war that, the term doesn't mean the same thing anymore. Yet before wars actually meant world war, they also didn't mean what they meant once the world wars actually occurred. So I believe there are certain deterrents to reduce the chance of us going back to that kind of full spectrum war again. Somebody may look at the nuclear weapons and say there's a nuclear deterrent that's reducing people from actually going to war. You're not going to get people risking the same way. Maybe there's just enough information. Like I just listened to this Dan Carlin Hardcore History. You should definitely check that out. That guy has some excellent material. But he was talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor and how there was so many different ways that if it was detected early enough, that wouldn't have happened, and how many different ways that the Americans may have actually been trying to incentivize or set up situations to get the Japanese to get that first attack on. There's so many things that are mixed up in there where I'm just thinking the amount of information out there, amount of access to information would change many situations that led to certain full spectrum wars occurring, certain disagreements heading to that point. Understanding that if I do this, the risk reward, which is something that we all have, is too high, so we're not actually going to go to that point. When people are like, oh, Donald Trump's going to get in there, he's going to have the nuclear button, and he's going to destroy the world, I don't think they literally mean that. I think it's more of a figurative thing, and it's something that you kind of dial back a bit on. So on the other aspect of this nuclear deterrent, I think there's also the nuclear enablement of peace, where you have nuclear energy coming in, or is it nuclear? However the wrong way to say it is, I want to say it in the wrong way. Anyway, so you have that situation where right now the current forms of nuclear technology is creating abundant reliable energy. And most wars are over resources.
Some of you who haven't looked into this lately should check and see what's being done with nuclear energy, nuclear power stations, and how they recycle some of the waste and how reliable these plants currently are. This is another case of taking things for granted, but this technology is very new. The first plant was Obninsk in 1954 in Russia, so this is a very new technology.
So you get to a situation where there's more reliable energy and there's going to be less chances for us to actually go to war with people. And then I talked about the initial thing of otherizing groups, how we all look at the human species now. There's some things that came out from the World War that I don't necessarily think would still be in the same way. I know people have disagreements with the whole European Union and like, no, we're not necessarily going to just all come together under this one umbrella. We want more freedom and individuality and control and differences. And I tell a lot of people in the United States of America, I see this term white race, black race as well, because that's been more personal to me. Before moving to the United States, it was at a time in, was it 94 around there? It's about 94, I think, where the media I was getting in Kenya was really old and sparse, and there was still a lot of things about the racial tensions that I was seeing there. At the same point, I just watched Sarafina in Kenya. I have some rather vivid memories of actually going to the movie theater, and it was a film based in South Africa during the apartheid times, during the switchover from that time, getting more independence in that situation. It's about a schoolgirl and the problems she was having from the Dutch settlers, who now many consider themselves South African. Well, anyway, so there are these racial tensions, white versus black. I was born in France, had moved back to Kenya. I wasn't old enough to actually be in this kind of situation, and I was getting to know the Kenyan relatives and family and things like that, and getting into a society, into a culture that I was rather unfamiliar with, but was told I belonged to. Then I see these racial tensions between white and black, even though I was born in a white area and I didn't really see any tensions as a little child, as a toddler, and things like that. Then I'm moving to the United States of America. I'm watching these films, seeing people burning crosses in people's yards and thinking, oh, the racial tensions are going to be horrible there. I don't want to go there. I had some worries about that. I get there and it wasn't really that big of an issue. I got to a place that was rather diverse. A lot of people were first generation Americans, a lot of people working in international organizations. So there was people from different places in the world and things like that. But as I got older, I started seeing this whole white-black thing. And post-college and post all this tension and post all this viewing of society, I have come to the point where I think the idea of white and black is a rather specifically American-centric thing, United States of America-centric thing. Because in Europe, there's still a lot of divisions. But I think post-war, they have more of a European identity where they wouldn't necessarily go back to that point where they'd be able to have these wars between the different states and countries. They may disagree culturally. They may have these other pseudo-mental wars, war on poverty, war on culture, war on this and this, war on ideology, but it won't get to the point where we'll just have full spectrum war that massive amounts of the actual population are actually in the direct line of fire. I don't really see that coming back. So we're on to the last 2 points. Thank you guys for listening. If you've made it through this whole thing in one sitting, good for you. We're getting on that last lap, that final stretch. But what is the main point of contention in a lot of these? I think one of the main points of contention where aggression only comes in is exchanging, is exchange of property. Wanting resources, wanting this from somebody else, we kind of get in a disagreement and then violence occurs. Now, money has helped that, and that is the next topic. So, exchange of property has existed since property existed. So the want itself is something that has existed in all known human history. I think where the aggression comes in was disagreeing on the value of things exchanged, on whether or not you're actually getting what you want or if it's worth this, or finding better ways to do this. So think about barter trade, think about the cowrie shells and things like salt and other proxies for actual goods that you want to exchange. Before paper currency and other promissory notes, how were things working? How would you actually go and tell that person about something? Before mathematic credit, those things like social credit, where you'd actually understand and know these people, how would you vouch for somebody else that, hey, yeah, you can exchange this with this person because I know this person? So there are all these different ways to do these that I think raise chances of violations of the non-aggression principle.
You're in a situation, you want the goat that the person has, he wants beans, all you have is cowrie shells, you really want that goat, he won't accept cowrie shells, so you assault him in order to get that goat and run off.
Now, even though all of you listen to this, most of you, I think again, 99.9% of you who are listening to this, have lived your entire life with money, with currency as a regular concept. But how many of you can actually, in your mind, imagine what you can do with $1 billion? Let alone the trillions of dollars that are actually out there in the world in debt. Are there even enough goods that you would be able to purchase, want to purchase, in the world if you were given all that debt as actual currency that you can spend? I want to make a point that I'm making a difference here between money and currency, which people use interchangeably when they're talking about it. Currency being a promissory note and money being something that's actually backed by something tangible. Because this is something that some of you may have already been thinking while listening to this, is with the invention of fiat currency, that made full spectrum more affordable, whereas it would have been too expensive if we were just using regular money. So I think this concept of money is a positive one. It's something that should be valued. It's something that, how would you explain this to somebody? How would you go to one of those undiscovered or untouched tribes in the Amazon and explain to them, oh yeah, just here's a credit card, or here's Bitcoin, here's cryptocurrency, use this instead of whatever mode of exchange that you're doing, and then now be able to have this land and you can have this medicine. How would you explain that to someone? I remember coming back to Kenya and being advised by my parents that in some situations, when you're going up country, when you're going to the rural area, when you're going to the village to meet the elders and meet the grandparents, meet the relatives in that situation, for some of them, they would prefer if you take them a few chickens rather than taking them 1,000 shilling notes. Even if those few chickens were 500 shillings each, for them, that actual physical chicken was more valuable. It was more tangible. It was something that they could accept more because that's how they looked at the world. So there is that aspect where I think there's certain concepts, there's certain things that many of us take for granted, that many of us agree make the world a better place, make things easier, make things more peaceful. That for some people, not because they dislike this thing, but just because they were raised in a different way, view that as something that's not quite as valuable. I think the non-aggression principle falls into that, where a lot of people are using it, where a lot of people could gain value of it, but it's about how do we communicate this to those people. And with that, we're here at the last point. Communication, information, understanding, and that's the internet. This is a positive change that has occurred. And this is the main reason why I think the non-aggression principle is not just imaginable, but practical, and more so day by day. Life is about information. It's about the exchange of information. It's about appropriating information from other locations. With more information, you can find better ways to deal with the basics of living, the basics of appropriation. How does your body get nutrition from other objects and absorb it and get to a situation where you can deal with being alive, with the condition of being alive? And that's through the sharing of information. So with the non-aggression principle, it's no longer a question of if it can be accepted, but rather how it will be accepted. If you listen to this, thank you once again. But preferably after you finish listening to this, you do have the ability to go on and get unprecedented access to information, at least historically. There may be some prehistorical stuff that we might be knowing that, oh, there might have been more civilizations before that, but that we know of in the accepted history of the world, you currently have what for 99.99999999999% of human history is unimaginable access to information. And recently I've been going through classic sci-fi and other books, and I just think of these great authors. How would they write their books if they lived today? Mostly you see this in sci-fi, like the pre-internet sci-fi, and some of the authors, some of the concepts and things that are brought up in there, like, hey, if somebody just had a cell phone, this whole book would change drastically. You have certain concepts of space travel and going light years and galactic civilizations. But even the most advanced people, the most elite, the top of the top in those societies, do not have access to a fraction of the information that you average human today has. You have people making the same mistakes because they don't have access to the history of how all those mistakes led to destruction. So the internet is a game changer as a device that can share information, which I think is the most important resource. And just as I mentioned before, there's positives and negatives. There's aspects like people might consider the nuclear bomb. That was a negative form of information from learning how to split atoms, but there's also nuclear energy in that sense. Now, with the internet, people might say pornography, that's a negative part of it, but people choose to go and access that pornography. And if you actually go in and look, the percentage of the internet that is actual porn sites is far less than you might think it actually is. But there's also all this information. How many people actually go past the first or second search page in whatever search engine they're using? Very few people. But there is thousands, millions in some cases of pages that people can actually access. If you want the information, it's almost certainly out there. So there's some things that don't have to be unimaginable anymore. You can just get access to it. You can get those answers without having to think it up yourself by getting help from all these other people that have thought it up. Or you have some of the greatest writers and creative minds who didn't imagine certain things that we consider unimaginable in the sense that we don't even think about it. It's just such a regular part of our lives. Now, in what's not going to be surprising for many of you, I am a fan of Ayn Rand, and one of my favorite books is Atlas Shrugged. Now, I've been thinking about how would this book be if it was brought to the cart here? If Rand was writing it today, how would she write it? Or if I was doing a screenplay, or if I was doing a retelling of it, how would I cast the characters? What changes would I make to the book?
So I came back after recording to add this in here. It's light on spoilers. It's a minute and 40 seconds, but if you just don't want any material about the book before reading it, jump ahead a minute and 40 seconds now.
Okay, Bagney Taggart. I think Taggart Transcontinental instead of a railroad company would be some internet provider based company. So instead of shuttling physical goods across the country, it would be shuttling information all across the world. Now we'll move on to Hank Rearden. He would still be involved in metals, but instead of Rearden steel for the train tracks, he would be involved in some new kind of metal that improves the miniaturization of the hardware that Dagny Taggart uses in her system. So this technology can also be used across other industries, and maybe to a situation where planned obsolescence is no longer something that people do, where the hardware can actually last long enough for people to go back into creating things where you buy something once and you use it for a lifetime. A quick nod here to Francisco d'Anconia, who, for giving one of the best speeches ever speeched in existence of speeches, he too would also run an information company, but it would be more based on the older models, and whatever happened in the story will also happen to that information company. Now, of course, there will be certain interests who want to control this information, want to control the ability to make these machines. There's going to be a battery that's developed that was abandoned, that is the perfect kind of battery to actually power these better machines and get information to more and more people in a more and more effective way. You're going to have a situation where people are not necessarily going to have to drop out because this certain gulch will actually be in virtual reality. So people can still be in society, yet they'll be pulling out of culture. And you already see that somewhat. There's people who are kind of just leaving society. They're not necessarily disappearing bodily, physically, but they're leaving certain spheres due to the changes in the social atmosphere in those spheres and the social pressures and the risk-reward basis in that situation. So we may be undergoing some sort of war. We may be undergoing some kind of mental aggression, some kind of strife might be going on. Some people could argue that we are under more violations of the non-aggression principle by living under these omnipresent states. But it's a different form of aggression than we faced for 99.9% of human history. I think it's a less aggressive in the general sense of it, and it's something that I think we can combat and switch out of in a much more imaginable way. So there we have it. Those are the points that I wrote up. What do you guys think? Can you think of any other points? We're in the conclusion now. You could stop listening, or you could keep listening. But in this conclusion, there's some things I'm going to repeat, summarize what I said before. Some things do bear repeating, but here we go into it. So how many things today were unspeakable in the past, how many things were unimaginable. Some thought witchcraft abounded at one time and that we had to be at a constant watch for it, or society would end. How many things today would be considered witchcraft to those very same people? There are many other things I could have discussed here. Things that you don't even have to go back to the past. You can just look at other places right now, current year, that these things aren't taken for granted. Things like bathing daily, having access to water to bathe daily, the access to paper you have, things you use paper with, having the ability to fly to other places, many other things like this. Just think about the levels of communication that we're living with today. Any of us can just get on Twitter and we can communicate directly, almost directly, to what many consider to be the most powerful human being on the planet right now, the President of the United States. You can go on there, just open an account, and talk directly to the person. You can insult their family, their intelligence, threaten their life, and all the time this person can find out where you live, who you are, and doesn't take that chance to come there or send people there to make you answer for what you said with your hide. And this is something that for most of human history, most of human civilization, was unimaginable to even talk to someone just a little higher on some kind of social scale than you in this kind of way. Yet you have the situation where now that massive gap in power, you can just reach over and talk to that person in that way without that person just automatically reaching over and touching you in ways that you do not want to be touched. So, with the increase to reliable energy and with that energy, the ability to acquire more and more resources has changed the world, and communication is another key of this, as I mentioned before. And I think we are leaving the information age and transitioning into the age of understanding. How many times does one have to hear something for them to internalize it and make it a part of their reality tunnel? How long does it take for something to become common sense? It took me decades to disabuse myself of certain collectivist and limiting ideas. For most of my life, I have unfortunately excused child abuse. For much of my childhood, I experienced some of it, and when I was growing up in my early 20s and things like that, I was like, okay, it's still something that's going to be included. I was one of those people that say, oh, society's breaking down because you don't actually hit your kids. But now I'm a staunch proponent of peaceful parenting. And it's something where I'm confident enough in that every time I hear somebody bring it up, if I'm in a certain situation, I'll want to talk to them about it. I'll want to communicate the importance of peaceful parenting because I believe they're trying to achieve a positive goal and they're doing it in a wrong way. I just need to inform them about this better way of doing it.
I've stopped being surprised about how often someone will actually say they've never heard of peaceful parenting.
And with the non aggression principle and peaceful parenting, I don't consider this to be a situation where somebody's trying to get from point A to B, but they're going the long way and I'm telling them the short way. This is more of me saying, I understand you're trying to get from A to B, but what you're currently doing is walking in the entirely opposite direction. So please at least turn around and use this way that's not just a shortcut, but will just get you there in a matter of seconds. So even though I've been aware of the non aggression principle for I think a decade now, it took me that time to get confident enough to make a presentation like this and present this information and feel it was something I can confidently talk about. So, what needed to happen to condense a millennia of human experience, to create this secular individualist way to address ways to avoid the outbursts of various levels of aggression? What did we need to take care of on a basic level? These are basic needs in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What had to happen to secure those basic life needs in order for us to be able to contemplate this as even a possibility?
What things had to happen for me to have enough time and knowledge and ability to make this video and for you to be able to share it with other people?
Some languages themselves don't even have the ability to communicate certain concepts like secularism and possibly freedom or individualism. So even if the language itself has that ability, just being able to communicate that, and I can personally attest to this. To my frustration, there was a recent situation where I was walking on the street and witnessed some public child abuse. This mother was very frustrated trying to help her daughter, but was hitting her, and I went in to stop, but there was a language barrier. My Swahili is basic conversational level, where I could not describe some simple concepts of peaceful parenting to her. And that frustration was really getting to me. And I understand that with the non aggression principle, with hearing about certain concepts, it takes me a while to understand. When I'm going through this quantum physics book that I mentioned at the start, I'm not understanding these, but I do understand enough that it works. Now, finding a way to actually internalize and get this topic and being able to converse about it to other people, that might be a different thing, but that doesn't change the fact that it actually works and it's an actual solid concept.
And if you aren't quite conversant yet at that point with this material, I still think you should speak up when you see something. You don't necessarily have to be able to provide a better way of doing something in order to warn someone or stop someone from doing the thing in the wrong way. For example, if you wanted to make one of those imitation animal carcass vegan burgers that I'm seeing around, I might not know exactly how to make it, but I can tell you that one of the ingredients is not actual animal carcass.
So, as I mentioned before, I think there is this new awareness, relatively new awareness of the human species, of all humans being part of this one group. Even the people who still don't necessarily see the world as a human organism like I do, they still have that general acceptance that at least humans are one group. Some people might consider that humans are apart from the world and they're a bad part, or humans are apart and they're a very unique and special part. I'm still team human above everything else, but I do consider it part of a human organism. This could be partly due to my own unique upbringing of having lived in different continents. But I do view human societies as organisms created by the humans that are a part of them, just like our bodies are made of cells. And I think this greater identity exists for many people in the world in senses where some of them apply it at the greatest point to their family or their friends or their tribe or their town or their city or their state or the nation, continent, races, generations, etc. But I take it further and go to Earthlings, Team Human, just we're part of this all. And the most important life form to me, as I said, is humans. But we're still a part of a mammalian animal as part of this greater biosphere that is the Earth. An Earth which, again, can be viewed as an organism made up of all that it contains. Or in another way, an infinitesimally small atom in a nucleus sized solar system. Or a cell sized galaxy that's been created as a sex gland sized cluster that is within a sex organ sized supercluster in a universe sized organism that is still simply a developing organism in search of another universe to reproduce with and create some kind of uber universal life form. So, when it comes to the non aggression principle, how unimaginable is it? Are we like cavemen who are met with a wheel and we say, oh, we can't actually use that? What is that? We're used to just walking around. It's unimaginable to use that just because we haven't been exposed or understood the possibilities of using this. If you could talk to a cell in your body, how would you explain to it that it's actually part of the greater organism that makes you? Would it matter to that cell?
I don't have to be X in order to relate to X. You out there are not me, but can actually have some input in what I do with my life.
So, this thing I finished up with about the universe as an organism, is it something that you could have imagined by yourself? If you've been alive for as long as the internet has existed, like I have, then it may be improbable for you to think about this, but it's not impossible. Since essentially you've had the same access to the same information that I have that enabled me to imagine something like this. But if you hadn't imagined it before, why hadn't you? Now that you have this concept in your mind of a universal organism, how would you go about telling somebody else about it? What is the basic criteria that would have to exist for you to be able to even communicate with this person and then let them know it, and not just know it, not just hear it, but to be able to accept before they can get past the step of just seeing humans as individual parts of the same general life form, the same general life form that they are a part of, that are worthy of the same considerations to not be aggressed against that they expect for themselves.
So that's it for the video, for the presentation, for the information. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I get a lot of joy just putting this material out, especially a topic like this where I really truly do believe it's going to make the world a better place. But one of the biggest benefits I get from this is having the conversation that we have after I release these topics. The initial video I made on the non-aggression principle, put that on social media. Somebody commented and said, "Oh, one of my problems with libertarians or these kind of people who talk about this is hypocrisy, or this is so impossible, it's not even worth speaking about." I said, "Okay, let me engage the person." And it turns out he thought it was worth speaking about enough to have a conversation with me back and forth. And then from that, I developed the script for this and was like, okay, got the ideas. And now here we are. The illustration that's going on, a friend of mine asked me to redo this old comic strip that her father had seen. Then I drew it, then I put it on the computer and thought, okay, it fits with these things together. So putting all these things together, finding different ways to communicate, different ways to inform. I think sharing this information is positive. Converse with me, talk to other people about it. Just recently heard a friend of mine might have switched to ANCAP, I'm not quite sure, but having more conversations with him. And I think the world will be a better place for that. So like, share, and subscribe. Till next video, links below to the merchandise store where you can get that drawing of the cavemen and things like that. And a bunch of other drawings. More videos, more content coming soon. Goodbye.